This is my viva voce for week 20. The question is, how did the 1950s deal with the lingering traumas of the Second World War? Although we tend to view the 1950s as a socially conservative and restrictive era, the people at the time saw group identity as a powerful tool to return normality to their lives after the chaos of World War II. So Americans dealt with the aftermath of the Second World War by embracing social conformity in many different forms. So three major groups that Americans embraced were sort of the consumerist suburban bourgeois culture, the neo-bohemian beat culture, and the neo-puritanical Marxist culture. So firstly, the large suburban bourgeois consumer culture was one of the larger groups in the 1950s for America. So in this group, social compliance becomes a virtue. In the 1950s, there's a growing middle class. This is a result of higher tax rates, people moving up from lower parts of society because they were in the war and they got paid well. There's just a general economic boom in America. And so with this new middle class, there's a new set of expectations that gets set in stone. There's this uniform culture that forms around this middle class. And so social compliance is a part of this, and it's a continuation of the strict military obedience that people were used to coming out of the war. So during the 50s, everything becomes understandable and enforceable, and this gives a sense of comfort. So there's a rigid dating culture in the 50s. Casual dating becomes a thing. Before the 1950s, in previous years, dating was usually acceptable only if you were planning on getting married later. But at this time, young men are expected to bring a date to most social occasions. There's a standardized set of rules and terminology that goes with dating. There are instructional videos that explain how you do it, what is conventional. There are written booklets of things that you do. So a couple of the rules are the woman has to answer yes or no immediately when being asked on a date. The man always speaks to the waiter and pays for the meal. Some of the vocabulary is keen, means that someone is interested in somebody else. The Little Black Book was a book for keeping people's numbers in it that the Bell Telephone Company issued in the 1950s. And so young men would keep track of lots of ladies' numbers so that they could go through it and call people when they needed a date. Carrying a torch is another term, also pinning, sort of claiming somebody a little bit, meaning that they're not going to date anybody else. And going steady means that you're more serious. And a Dear John is a breakup letter. So car culture is sort of entwined with dating culture. Cars became a sort of a symbol of masculinity and status during the 50s. Cars were really cool. They had lots of color and chrome parts. In order to buy cars and take girls out on dates, the debt in America rose tremendously during the 50s, along with them buying all the other consumerist articles. So from 1945 to 1960, the debt for the average American rose from $5.7 million to $56.1 billion. That's a fact. Rock and roll was another part of sort of consumerist culture. People had money to go out to concerts, to buy records. Rock and roll was a combination of sped up blues and skiffle music. And rock and roll sort of signified youth culture. So Frank Sinatra, who's not a youth, said, "Rock and roll is the most brutal, ugly, degenerate, vicious form of expression, lewd, sly, and plain fact, dirty. A rancid-smelling aphrodisiac in the martial music of every side-burned delinquent on the face of the earth." So, Bill Haley in his Comets made the first rock and roll song, and Jerry Lee Lewis was another rock and roller who added a southern country touch to rock and roll, and eventually returned to the country side of things and married his cousin. During the 50s, everyone had sort of acquired mass-produced items. They were everywhere, and so there were new fashions in clothing fashion and other areas that the fashions were designed to indicate your status. So in clothing fashion, there's a return to Victorian femininity. Some of the designers are Dior, Chanel, Givenchy, Balenciaga, among others. Television was another thing that unified this middle-class culture. There were only 3 stations, so most people were watching the same things. The tech innovations of World War II also led to fast food and restaurant chains. So the standard method of the fast food restaurant was to have sort of a buffet. And that was the standard way things were. So Cock Robin, which was in Wheaton, where Shane's is, they invented the milkshake multi-mixer thickener, which really sped up the milkshake making part of the process. And they sent this guy, Roy Kroc, to go out and sell them to other restaurants. And so, Ray Kroc, he went to sell it to McDonald's, which was just like they had one shop. And he was inspired by their cook-to-order system. And he, I think you call it buying a franchise. He bought a franchise, he bought a McDonald's, and he did it better than the original McDonald's and undercut them and took over McDonald's. And so the Cock Robin multi-mixer leads America to get obese, kind of. So that's the bourgeois suburban middle class culture. So secondly, there's a neo-bohemian beat culture. So John Fawcett says, "As Americans, we love the pragmatic, the bold, and the different, but we sometimes sacrifice our historical consciousness on the altar of innovation." So some people were wrapped up in the rock and roll culture and fashions and all that, but some people rejected that. They're saying that's not real culture. We're gonna do our own thing. That's better. And so the people from the Beat generation focused on self-expression, but it was still rooted in consuming things in a way. So the Beat generation was started by the authors Jack Kerouac and Allen Ginsberg. Part of it all was going on spiritual quests, taking psychedelic drugs, sort of sexual liberation, rejecting materialism. They did a lot of drugs and alcohol. I think I already said that. It's worth repeating. They were also very nihilistic, so they thought that one has to create meaning for oneself in the world. The Beat generation was into jazz. During the 50s, jazz bands got smaller as general employment rose, and some areas of jazz became increasingly avant-garde. John Coltrane's Giant Steps comes out of this era, and it's really complicated, and there are lots of random chords, not random, but crazy key changes and stuff like that. We also have abstract art, which is also very much about expressing oneself and not really in any particular form. And so Jackson Pollock is a member of this part of the beat culture. beat poetry. Allen Ginsberg's A Supermarket in California expresses the Beat's desire, or the desire of the beatnik culture, to return to rootedness in earlier parts of American culture. So, thirdly, Marxism is another alternative group identity. So, some criticize the Soviet Union, lots of people criticize the Soviet Union and Marxism during the 50s because of lots of people dying in the Soviet Union. It doesn't seem like the most viable thing, but some people double down on it in the US. It becomes a sort of secular Christianity. So they value self-denial, simplicity, and non-consumerism. They also value a collectivist identity. So yes, they lived very simply. I did not mark this down, but a poem by Lenin expresses the sort of idea of collectivism. He says, "Who needs a one? The value of a one is thinner than a squeak. Who will hear it? Only the wife. A one is nonsense. A one is zero." And so Soviet propaganda and culture sort of expresses their collectivist ideals. So the play Yosaga is about a mountain climber who hurts his leg, and then he's with a group of his friends, and they see a storm coming along, and they have to get off the mountain. And so the one who has the hurt leg sacrifices himself in order to let the others jump down on him and survive. The Marxists had materialist ethics, so they did not believe in an afterlife, so they sought to prolong their lives as long as possible. The Marxists subverted authority, and they're sort of on a secret mission to take down capitalism, and that bound them together more. Marxist art was part of Marxist art was the social realism movement. So they tried to create images of the laboring masses, and they believed that art was a weapon to stop capitalist exploitation. So, although we think of the 50s as sort of a repressive, restrictive era, the Americans of the 1950s saw group identity as a way to find safety and security. It's pretty much mean the same thing. After the chaos of World War II. And the three major groups that people participated in were suburban bourgeois consumerism, neo-bohemian beatnik culture, and neo-puritanical Marxism. Thank you.